Good morning, everyone. Maybe just as a way of introduction, I'm a mathematician. I love statistics. I have about 4,000 graphs I'm not going to show you. Have you ever woken up one day and realized you're in the wrong place? Completely in the wrong place. I was the MD of this large insurance company. I had everything that life, theoretically, that you would want. Oodles of money, houses on 3 continents, a wife that loved me, and I was desperately unhappy. And I was desperately unhappy for a couple of reasons, but one of the primary reasons was that I had left South Africa behind. And no matter where I went in the world, there was this part of me that said, I don't understand this place. So one morning, 11 o'clock in the morning, I was sitting in a board meeting, B-O-R-E-D, looking out the window, and it was pitch black at 11 o'clock in the morning, northern Germany with a bunch of directors. And I did the unforgivable sin. I needed to make a change, but I didn't know how to make it without making a radical statement. So I stood up at the end of the board meeting and I said, gentlemen, I am so sorry, I resign. And I ran like a little boy down to reception, caught a taxi, went to the airport, flew to Frankfurt, flew to Joburg, flew back to Cape Town, and I've never practiced again as an actuary. And it's been the greatest blessing of my life. Because to do the things that you want to do, that you were born to do the things that that's your purpose. So what's my purpose? I come back with this heartfelt longing for South Africa. And I come back and Jelle Bliksem says, I'm all negative. I leave in the 90s, I come back in the 2000s, and everyone is like, oh, the world's coming to an end. And so I was asked to give a presentation, and someone said, you must be the big positive guy. 2009, the market had crashed. All the estate agents looked at me and said, no, you're still so positive. And I gave a presentation, and in that moment, I realized 2 things. I realized I was born to encourage. I was born to motivate. And the thing that I could do is I could do it in a way that didn't just encompass sunny skies and Chevrolet. I could use all the training that I had to explain it in a way that made sense using both economic and political terms. So for the last 10 years, I've been a political and economic commentator. I speak about those things no one wants to speak about. And this morning, I'm going to be spending a lot of time about land expropriation. And I want to tell you the truth, what's actually happening. So I'm nearly 60 years old. I'm not sitting there this last December, I get a phone call and the guy says, hi, this is Smile Radio. We're different to all the other radio stations. We only amplify good news. And we like what you stand for. My company is called The Big Positive Guy. We like what you stand for. Would you like your own radio show? So I said, yeah, why not, eh? I haven't done that before. And I went inside there and the guy said to me, I have some reservations. Firstly, you're 30 years older than all the other broadcasters. You're also the only non-media person, and you're also the only non-qualified journalist. But we trust that your content will be good enough. Well, first thing that happened is I played with the sound desk for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks I sat full-time, trying to learn this little sound desk, trying to understand the traffic desk, and the news things and the Reuters feeds were coming out, and I realized that I am far too old for all this stuff because I can't speak and press buttons at the same time. So now I have a little sound engineer called Ahmad. Ahmad sits here and plays this thing like the piano, and I just speak. And when I was appointed, they gave me the Sunday morning show, which is a dead time, 15,000 listeners, and within 6 months, and I was allowed in the beginning to do 3 minutes per hour for 4 hours. 3 minutes per hour. I could tell one 3-minute story. In June, our listenership had gone to 60,000. You see, we as a nation, we starved of good news. We starved of happy stories. We cannot understand where all this negativity has suddenly come from. And so now what happens, my radio show is 2 hours, and I made a mistake. I said, I want to talk all the time. So now they've given me that. So now I speak 40 minutes an hour for 2 hours. And yes, like I spent about a day and a half working, trying to find new content. all the time, but it's one of the best things I've ever done. But I've learned so much in the process of doing this business. My boss is one of the old boys of radio, and he told me stories about what it used to be like 20 and 30 years ago. So I'd been there for 3 months. Now when I sit there, it's so sexy. You've got all these lights and cameras and little discs and everything's going mad, and it's Facebook Live running, and there's newsreaders sitting in the back making urgent phone calls and finding out what the news is and coming in on the hour and reading the news. Well, my boss called us all in and said, from now on, we're no longer doing the news like it's been done for the last 20 or 30 years. We are no longer going to read the news that comes in over the wireless or over the ticker tapes, or in this case over the internet. And the reason for it is nearly 40% of the news that we are given as a radio station is not true. Nearly 40% of the information, and a majority of that comes from reputed organizations like the SABC, ETV, Eyewitness News, News 24. We sit there and we look at it and we say, is this true? And so often what it is a catchy headline, what they call clickbait. They're trying to get you to read the news, so they put this really sexy thing in like 5,000 teachers to lose their jobs in the Western Cape. If the proposal that was made by the DA goes ahead, and if this happens, and if that happens, we can't make decisions in life based on ifs, but we can react negatively to all this negative input that's come along. So we made a decision that we would re-research all the news that came in. Let me give you an example. Last week, it was reported that Minister Nene resigned. Most of the radio stations reported instantaneously that this was now the end. Have you heard that one before? Knows at the end, and now you must pack for Perth. When the finance minister leaves, this is the end. We saw it as an enormously positive step. Not because we didn't like Minister Nene, we think he's an amazing guy, but because for the very first time, in maybe a few decades, we saw someone take accountability. Someone stand up and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. When half the parliamentarians that we see walking around in Parliament today have done way more, that have had far more visits to the Gupta Saxon World Shabin than Minister Nene, are still sitting there. In this case, a man of integrity who stood up and said, I will stand down. But we reported that as good news. And I was quite interested to see that the Rand followed suit. The Rand went up 1%, because when you make the right decision, it's always the right thing to do. And the market said that. They said, Minister Nene, we recognize that this was the thing that you needed to do. So we were so terribly impressed by this. So I adopted a little girl a few years ago. She's now 15 years old. And for those of you who are 15-year-old, I'm sure you know where I am. And it's not easy. But it's also not easy for her. Coming from a different background, and suddenly coming into our home, and then hitting teenage puberty, and being thrust into the joys of school today. My daughter started feeling depressed, and then started having panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And I took her through to the doctor, and the doctor said, she needs antidepressants. She's 15 years old. My daughter resisted, I resisted, the doctor got all aggressive, and said she will take these antidepressants. So we took them for a while. My daughter begged us and said, please, I don't want to take these things. They make me feel completely numb. I don't want to take them. So we went along to the counsellor at school, and I was chatting to her, and I said, Michelle, my daughter's on antidepressants. What's going on? Am I doing something wrong? And she said to me, Mr. Toit, there are 180 children in grade 9 in this school. And this year, so far, this was about June, so far this year, 9 of them have spent more than a week in a mental clinic. Something's going wrong. The negativity which surrounds us continuously is starting to have physical effects upon us and upon our children. I often see things being passed along the internet where they're using the children to talk about things like expropriation. Die mense gaan ons huis vat. the impact on those children must be absolutely astronomical. So why do I tell you all these things? Because I love reading. And every single week I have to read one book. And I have to report on it on the radio station. And a few months ago I read a book, and if you are a lover of books, you've got to read this one. It's called Enlightenment Now. Enlightenment Now by Dr. Steven Pinker. Now, it's not the lightest reading in the world. It's social philosophy, 650 pages. You can absolutely adore it. It's all science, and the first 350 pages is just maths and graphs. You still want to read it? Or you want to listen to my version? Dr. Steven Pinker is one of the top professors at Harvard. And he wanted to see what is the state of South Africa like at the moment. And so what they did is they looked at a whole lot of parameters and said, worldwide, how well are we doing at the moment? If we looked at things like poverty and famine and war and death and mortality and all the things that we really have classed ourselves to say, how far have we come? How well are we doing? And here was the shock. The absolute shocker. The table after table. Now remember, I'm a mathematician. I'm not interested in how the people feel. I'm interested in the statistics. And statistically, hold your breath, we have never ever been in a better place in the history of mankind than we are today. Never ever. It's shocking, because half of you don't believe it. And what happens, page after page, every page he turned over, I was like, oh my word, I can't believe what he's saying. If you want to read an easier book, try Factfulness. Factfulness by Dr. Hans Rosner. Brilliant book. It just basically says that everything that you perceive about the world is probably wrong. They took things like poverty. They took things like starvation. You know, 20 years ago we had 6 billion people on this planet. And nearly 2 billion at any one stage were starving to death. Today we've got over 7 billion people, and 700 million people are regarded as living below the poverty line. 700 million from 2 billion. And the population has increased. But here's the interesting thing. There are people below the poverty line in certain countries where the line is drawn quite high that still have paid television and cars and are regarded as living below the poverty line. Infant mortality is the lowest that's ever been in the history of man. The average child, not the child born in the United States or Europe, the average child born on this planet today can expect a life expectancy of 80 years old. Mothers dying at birth is almost non-existent. Smallpox has been eradicated. There are limited number of polio cases. I think there were 3 cases of polio in Africa this year, and it is literally on the verge, within the next 4 or 5 years, of polio being eradicated as a disease. We walk around in our pockets with the knowledge of mankind tucked in our telephones. Has anybody told you 2017? Nobody tells you this good news. 2017 was the very first year in the history of aviation that not one commercial plane crashed worldwide. The first time in history that it's safer to fly. If you fly in a commercial plane, you're guaranteed, almost guaranteed, to get to the other side. But the most amazing thing is that even incidents of lightning has gone down 95% to what it was 20 years ago. And he was starting to say, as a scientist, what is happening? Well, first of all, there was better research. There was better technology in terms of vehicles and tractors and the people who were being struck by lightning. Houses were better insulated. In almost every sphere of life, we're doing fantastically well. And that you are living in the best of times ever. And then the 350th page started. And then he turned over the page and he said, as a psychologist, I then went out and I did interviews with people to say, what do you think about the incidence of war, or terrorism, or famine, or disease? And here's the interesting stat. 87% of people had completely the opposite view. Only 13% of people said we live in the best of times. Only 13% of people believe that this is the time to be alive. So what's going wrong? And this for me was the fascinating thing, because again, as a scientist, as a Harvard psychologist, he goes through the study and looks to see what is the cause of us sitting in this completely negative scenario. Now, if a lion comes through that door, which I'm in Pretoria, I don't know if you guys still have lions, but maybe, if a lion came through that door, it would be very prudent of you to run and stand behind me. Not because I'm going to fight off the lion, but you probably are able to run faster than me. So what happens, it's a natural, instinctive process for you to want to defend yourself. And so what happens with us today is that never in the history of mankind, that same little thing that sits in our pocket is feeding us news almost continuously. And most of it is bad. Most of it is negative. And you, quite naturally, are defending yourself and would have it to say, oh, I'm not going to do this. Oh, scared of that. Killers. So all of a sudden we find people sitting at the bar that are desperately worried about whether Donald Trump is going to be attacking North Korea. What the hell has that got to do with you? It's not something that we worried about 5, 10, 20 years ago. 20 years ago when you were running around as a little child, or 40 years ago in my case, you were running around as a little child. The reality is all we worried about is, am I going to get home in time before I get a hiding? Have I done my homework? Is there going to be a sandwich for me to eat when I get home? And that was probably the extent of my worries. Now what happens, our children worry about all kinds of things. You worry about things that you were never intended to worry about. And it's natural. The fear that you hear, when people start talking about expropriation, half of you, immediately, you can see people's hearts go, it's like a vice closing on it. And the reason for that is because you don't know the truth. The reality is what's happening in land expropriation, and let's change the word right now and never use the word land expropriation again. Let's use the word, as Cyril has specifically asked in the last 2 weeks, of land reform. Let's start using the word land reform. The language that we use does not need to be negative, because it's not a negative process. But what happens when we continue to use those negative words, we start making assumptions. We suddenly assume that farms, land, the job as an estate agent, the job as a conveyancing attorney is under threat, when nothing has actually been decided. Not a single thing has been put on paper yet. And yet all of you are panicking. You see in strange scenarios of King Goodwill's Vellatini teaming up with AfriForum. Here's two strange beds, little bed friends, because they're frightened of something that hasn't even happened yet. So what I'm going to do today is I want to try to tell you the truth. I want to tell you some of the things in terms of the land reform that are actually true. Now, I've been a political commentator, as I say, for 10 years. I think I'm fairly well qualified to do it. I speak to everyone. I have managed to get into the offices of the president on a number of occasions to work with him. I've spoken to the unions. I've spoken at Marikana. I've spoken to the DA. I've spoken to the EFF. I've been to the farmers' unions, and I'm exceptionally well read. And I think I know a little bit about what's going on. And I've had the privilege of sitting down with some of the major decision makers that you guys read about and asking them the very, very direct questions that I'm sure you would love to ask. And at the moment, I'm a TEDx coach. Everybody's heard of TED.com. And the person that I'm coaching is Professor Ruth Hall from UCT. She's in charge of the Faculty of Economics and Agrarian Studies. And guess what her TED talk is about? Land reform. Land reform, the biggest opportunity this country has ever been given. How is she qualified to speak about it? Well, she's one of the 10 people that have been allocated to make the decisions on how land reform would look. My little 10-man team that the president set aside, she sits on that team. She sits with me twice a week, and we go through and say, what is the latest thing that's happening in terms of land reform? By the way, that 10-man team, has anybody looked at it? Look to see who's on the team? These are the people that are going to make the decisions about whether we're going to take your house or not. How many politicians out of 10? Let's have a guess. Quick guess, come on, don't you. There's no wrong answer. There's one. David Mabuza is the chairman. The rest of them are academics, farmers, the chairman of Agri-Forum, small black farmers. These are the people that are making the decisions about what potentially land reform could look like into the future. So if you've got a little pen and paper, I want to give you some of the reasons, and these come straight from the office of the President. These are some of the places where it was always intended that the land was going to come from. When they started speaking about expropriation, let me just quickly put that into context. When they started speaking about expropriation, the process of land reform and restitution has not worked, as you all know. It has not worked well. And one of the reasons it's not worked well is that we go through the process and say, is this piece of land, does it belong to someone else historically? And if they go along to court and they say, yes, this does, then we go to the next phase of the game. And the next phase of the game, so let's determine value. And what happens, we come to the next stage of determining value. There's been this complete breakdown between the farmers and the landowners and what the government is prepared to offer. In some cases, it's been very good. Mala, they got paid out 5 billion rand. That's not too bad, eh? It's not too shabby. But often it's come to the point where it grinds to a halt. That's when expropriation is going to come in. That's when they say, we've gone through the process, we've looked at everything, we cannot resolve this issue anymore legally. This is when expropriation comes. But that wasn't the intention behind land reform. Land reform said, is there a way that we can take this country and turn it around? Just imagine, just for a moment, that we could use land reform to change this country like it has never, ever been changed before. Instead of just tinkering with it on a little bit on the side and tinkering a little bit on this side, what happens if we took it and used it as an economic injection to physically change the character of this country? What would it be like if this worked and in 2 years' time we were chatting with Steve and we were looking at growth rates of 12%, where employment started disappearing, where people were economically empowered, where we were sitting in a stage where the taxpayer base could be doubled? What would it look like then? And are there opportunities like it? Well, these are the 5 things, which were 4 things that they said that they wanted us to look at. The first thing is, I don't know if you've ever heard the word the Ingonyama Trust. The Ingonyama Trust was set up in 1994, and the reason for it was that traditionally black ownership was completely different to the title deed. If you go to Natal, there are tens of thousands, if not a few million people living on tribal lands. In 1994, they set up a whole system of tribal leadership. They get paid an astronomical amount of money to administer these lands on behalf of their tribes and on behalf of their people. And they all operate under a trust. And it's been done exceptionally poorly. It's been done exceptionally poorly because what happens is it's become political. So if you're living in my area of control and you don't vote for a certain political party, it is within my rights to kick you off. Also, if I need a little bit of money, nothing stops me from kicking you off your piece of land and selling it to the next person who's come along offering me 50,000 or 100,000. We've seen on carte blanche of rich farmers going down to the Transkei and for 2 cases of Klipdrift whiskey, buying 100 meters of beachfront property in the Transkei. It's not been done particularly well. But here's the worst part of it. There are estimated to be between 8 and 12 million people living on tribal lands. Imagine living on a piece of land, not just for a year or 2, but for generation after generation. I always love to use the example of the Valley of 1,000 Hills in Natal. Imagine there are little 1,000 Zulu families, each one living on a hill, that have been living there for 200-300 years. You are the Dlaminis. You live on this farm, this piece of land, this hill, but this hill is worth nothing to you because your tenure on it, your existence on this land can be wiped out like this. You can turn around tomorrow and say, I want to vote the DA, and you and your whole family will be booted off. There are so many instances at the moment where the leader of the family dies and a woman is left in charge. And what happens, they get kicked off because the women are not regarded as traditional leaders of a family or of a community. Imagine if we could take that little valley of 1,000 hills, and on each little hill can say that community, this is your land. And we can break it down into the individual families, and we can draw some lines, and we can draw up the title deeds, and we can say, this is your home. Imagine for the very first time that you could do whatever. You as a state agent should be ecstatic. Can you imagine if this happened right across the country, where millions of people potentially could end up being landowners with their own defined piece of land, which they can do with what they want. So they could stay on it, they could rent it out, they could sell it, they could loan against it, they could send their children to university using the land as the capital. There's all kinds of economic implications that will make massive difference. If you're a tribal leader, do you like the idea? No. If you think a white farmer is going to be more upset about his land being taken away, then I think you understand the political negotiation that still has to happen between all the tribal leaders and the leaders of this government, because that's one of the things they want to do. The second place where we're going to find land is the state-owned enterprises. That's something that's become a dirty word. Every single organization that is owned by the government owns enormous tracts of land right across this country. Just think of Eskom and Telkom. Every single place where you see a telephone line or a power cable or anything like it, somewhere along the line there is an Eskom piece of land. They all around. Go to Megawatt Park and look at the amount of open space around Megawatt Park. Why are 15,000 workers living in Soweto when they could be living right outside Eskom's door? Why is that not a possibility? In Cape Town, for those of you that know Cape Town, we have 3 enormous tracts of land that are owned by the military. Wingfield, Esterplaat and Youngfield. Right in the heart of the town. Right in the heart of the town. Youngsfield is probably almost as big as our southern suburbs. And what do we do with it? The one Air Force base has got 1,200 soldiers looking after a bunch of broken down planes. It's not being used properly. In all the surveys that we've done out in the Western Cape, the people don't want to live on the flats anymore. It costs them a fortune to come in the city. They want to go where the work is. They want to come closer to the town. Our estimates are there are pieces of land in a city like Cape Town that if you come on and you say, oh no, there's no land available. The reality in terms of state-owned enterprise land, there's probably a host space for 1 million people. Not to have little RTP houses, but to have proper low-cost housing right where the work is. The government has looked around and said, for the third place where we could get land from is the actual government itself, which has become a little bit of a joke. Every time they mention it in Parliament, they always laugh because they're continuously finding more and more land that they own that they don't know that they own. The figure at the moment is 500,000 pieces of land which the government owns, which the government turns around and says, is this bringing us any income? Is this making us any money? Or is it actually costing us money that we are now having held responsible to keep it clean, fence it off, make sure it's secure, make sure squatters don't move on it? Is there something we could potentially do with this land that would make it massively more economically viable for the country, as opposed to us just having a list of 500,000 properties? Our homelands. When the homelands were drawn, these are the Transkais and Ciskais and Kwakwas, we all know where they are. When they were drawn up in their wisdom, what happens, all these people who were displaced and moved to those homelands so that they didn't cause chaos. There was no land ownership granted. What they did do is they used the system of 99-year lease. But it wasn't a case of I went along there and said, here I am, Mr. Dlamini, can I have a piece of land, can I sign it off from the government of Kwakwa? The reality is there was no government, there was no one to sign it off, so I just moved airy-fairy in there, and there's this notion of a 99-year lease, but no one's actually paying anybody anything, and there's nobody's living on the land that he's supposed to be living on. What happens if you turned around today and made a ruling? I don't know what the ruling. If you have lived for 15 years in the same place, we will give you the title deed. Would that make a difference? To make a difference is like the starfish. It would make a difference in that family's life, for sure. How many pieces of land are we talking about? Astronomical. Astronomical sections of the community can be empowered completely by the land reform process if we do it right. Now, there's a political component to everything that I have said. And the political component is that all revolves around one man, Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa has come in December after he won the ANC caucus to be the president of this country with probably the slimmest of margins. I've had the good fortune of meeting him. I've had the good fortune of working with people who know him exceptionally well. I've had the good fortune of researching him for almost 9 months. And I want to say to you is that one of the comments that Brant made is that very often we judge organizations by the quality of the leadership. And I believe that whether it's by divine intervention or whether it's by pure luck, we have got one of the most amazing men sitting at the helm of this country. And I want to tell you a little bit more about it, because he became president, and I think very few of us know who he is. So in all the research that I've done with him and all the interviews I've done with people who know him, I've tried to build up a picture of what kind of a guy is he. So let's quickly start off. Firstly, he's fairly apolitical. He did not grow up in a political family. He grew up in a very middle class to upper class family. He is not one of the traditional tribes. He's a Venda. When the trouble started happening in Soweto, his family moved and they went somewhere else. He wasn't exposed to all the violence of the townships and what happened in Soweto. He went to the University of the North and he studied of all things law. If you want to be president of this country, you've got to be a lawyer. He studied law. How many of you know that he went to prison? How many of you know that he spent 300 days in solitary in 1976? For what? Because he joined a radical organization at the University of the North called the Students' Christian Association. He joined the Students' Christian Association, met some very interesting people like Mogoeng, our Chief Minister of Justice. And what happens, while he was sitting there, he came across a radical piece of literature, and the radical piece of literature was called the Black Consciousness Movement. If you read the Black Consciousness Movement, and you had to summarize it in a paragraph, the paragraph that you summarize says the following things. God does not make mistakes. God made black people deliberately, and they have no need to apologize for being black. Cyril Ramaphosa liked that statement. He didn't want to apologize for being black, and he wanted to bring it into the Student Christian Association Constitution. And what he didn't stand up there and toy. He started a democratic negotiation process which took several months before they started thinking about adding it into the constitution of the Student Christian Association. But unfortunately for him, it was 1976, and the secret police, or the security police, decided that he was a stoorer, that he wasn't something, and they threw him into solitary confinement for 300 days. It's one of the worst things that can possibly happen to a human being, to be locked up, especially if you don't even come from that background. It's one thing if you know why you're there, but when you're a young, well-brought-up young guy, the most dangerous thing you've done is join the Christian Association, to be locked up for 300 days. In his autobiography, he says one of the things. He said for 300 days, there was a crack in the wall above the toilet. And every day, at various stages of the day, he would climb up onto the toilet to try and reach, to look through the crack, to see if it was day or if it was night. He only realized afterwards that he was underground when he got out. He lived in a room for 300 days, not see another person, not speak to another person. other than a bed and a toilet and food that came through a slot. His one-line summary that he has in his autobiography says, "I learned then that people treat you like a tea bag. They use you once and then they throw you away." This is a man who has learned to stand on his own 2 feet. He is not swayed by the crowd. He's not easily swayed by the community. Traditional politics in this country is very much, we have the Ndunas and the Ngabas, and we get all our words from those things. So we sit down and we discuss it endlessly for days and days. I think in Cyril Ramaphosa he pays homage to that, but the reality is that he's a man who knows what he wants. When he qualifies as an attorney, instead of going out and doing what would have made him a ton of money as practicing an attorney, he's still not in the world of politics out of interest. He's still not a politician. He's not part of a political party. He starts negotiating with the strongest company at that stage in the country, other than SA Breweries, Anglo-American. And Anglo-American realizes that at some stage there's going to be a black union, and they're looking for a non-political, well-spoken, educated black man who they can bring to the boardroom table they believe they can control. And Cyril Ramaphosa is there. Bobby Godson and Cyril Ramaphosa get on well, and he starts the National Union of Mine Workers, and within 5 years builds it up to be the biggest union in the country, 400,000 workers. And the first time that the union flexes its muscles, white South Africa and apartheid South Africa shuddered, because we suddenly realized what it done, and he had very quietly built up one of the most powerful organizations. He develops a skill at that moment where I will confidently say is that our president is potentially one of the best negotiators in the world. And again, in his books, when you look at it, he defines the art of negotiation is not necessarily winning every war, every battle. He takes a long-term vision and he looks and says, how do I win this war at the end of the day? So many people criticized him when he was deputy president. Why didn't he do something? What about the Guptas? Why didn't he kick Zuma out? Why didn't he say anything? But the reality is that at any moment in time he had said that he wouldn't even have seen the elections. If he had said in March last year, I don't like what's happening with President Zuma, he would have been history. He would have been kicked out. He waited until the right moment. That's what good negotiators do. There was somebody else who thought that he was an amazing guy. In 1989, President Mandela heard about this young unionist and asked him to come down to Cape Town to visit him in Victor Verster, and loved him. Zelda Lagrange in her book says that Nelson Mandela said when he met Cyril Ramaphosa, it was like meeting the Crown Prince. He said, this is the man I want to have follow me as the president of this country. This is the kind of educated, well-spoken, thoughtful businessman, humanitarian, that I think should follow me. So much so that a lot of you might have forgotten that when President Mandela was released, and they had the release committee, they appointed not their traditional ANC guys, but they appointed Cyril Ramaphosa to be in charge of that committee to get them out. And some of us might still have the image of Nelson Mandela sitting there at Cape Town Town Hall speaking, and he's not very familiar with the mic. And what happens is a young, bushy Afro guy sticking the mic in his hand, and that young man, is Cyril Ramaphosa. We forget that he was there at all the key junctions of the political history when we changed. So we changed, and what happens is Mandela gets released, and everything is completely different. And now we have to negotiate. But what happens, the Nats are completely convinced that they're going to take this land and chop it up into a million little pieces, and they're going to slaughter us and drive us into the sea. So over and above the legislature of this country, we start discussing this incredible document called a constitution. A constitution there is to protect us in case this whole thing of power sharing goes hopelessly wrong. And they put their top negotiators, and the ANC decides that their top negotiator is Cyril Ramaphosa, and the Nats decide that the top negotiator is Tertius Delport. also a lawyer, top lawyer. 3 months later, FW de Klerk pulls him out because poor old Tertius has been absolutely demolished. They take one of their top guys, and those of you remember Rolf Meyer. Rolf Meyer was the Minister of Defense. You didn't get much more senior than that. Another attorney, and they take this attorney and they make him head of the Constitutional Affairs, and something interesting happens. Cyril and Rolf click. They click absolutely beautifully. There's a wonderful story in both their books. Rolf is a passionate fly fisherman, and he owns a place in Dullstrom. And when all the negotiations, for those of you old enough to, if your mind can still remember that far, when all the negotiations broke down at one stage because of the Cartergate and Boipatong massacre, something strange happened. Those two men spent 48 days together in Dullstrom, fly fishing and discussing what the constitution of this country could look like and what the Bill of Rights could look like. For me, it's the most amazing image. Imagine 1992, 1993, a black man and a white man sitting there catching trout and discussing the document that today excites us so much. At one stage, Rolf Meyer tells about while he was fishing, he did the unforgivable sin. He pulled back hard and the hook went deep into his finger. For any of you that are fishermen, there's only one cure for a hook that's deep in your finger, because it's got a barb that comes backwards. Is what you have to do is you've got to push it right through. You've got to push it right through, take the pliers, clip off the barb, and then put it back again. And Rolf Meyer turns to Cyril and says, "Do you think you can do this?" And Cyril turns to him and says, "Do you trust me to do this?" So Rolf fortifies himself by drinking 3/4 of a bottle of brandy. They stand there, face to face, looking at each other in the eye, and Cyril pushes it right through his finger, cuts off the barb, and pulls it back. Rolf Meyer, in his book, says, "At that moment, I recognized a man I could trust." Cyril Ramaphosa, in his book, says, "In that moment, I saw what Rolf Meyer looked like when he was scared. And I knew when he got that look on his face, I pushed him too hard." We always talk about the Constitution like it's a flippant little piece of paper. We suddenly now like, it's ours, don't mess with our Constitution. Can I ask you, if you feel possessive or protective about the constitutional document, how much more so do you not think Cyril Ramaphosa is protective of this document? This document that forms his legacy. He then goes out into business. The next thing that he does, he makes a few bob. By 2014, 20 years later, when President Zuma says to him, "Will you come back in the government?" he says yes. It is calculated that Cyril Ramaphosa is worth 2.6 billion rand. Now, for any of you that say that he was given this money, you obviously don't understand the history of what happened in those 20 years. The majority of what he did, there were so many people who were benefactors of the BEE system. There are very few that managed to make it a success, for the sheer reason that very often the companies who were handing out shares handed out the junk to the people that were standing up there as wanting to be BEE guys. They handed them the junk shares within the large organizations, and they never made enough money to actually be able to pay them the shares back, and eventually walked away with nothing. That's not the case with Cyril Ramaphosa. He used it effectively, made amazing investments, and walks away with 2.6 billion rand. But he's not allowed to have that as the deputy president of the country. He's got to pack it away. He's got to hide it in trusts and do all kinds of things. He's got to not be seen to be benefiting in any sort of way. It takes him, it's so much money, it takes him 18 months before he can actually join the government of this country. 18 months. So where's his money now? Come on guys, you're estate agents, here's a rich guy. What did he do with his money? Where is it? Is it in Switzerland? Is it tucked away in some little trust in KVV's back pocket? The reality is that almost all of it has been invested in land, in two kinds of land specifically. One is agriculture, Our president is an avid cattle farmer. He believes that there are better cattle available worldwide than the cattle that we produce, that are more resistant to disease, that are all kinds of, so many different ways that are better. And he has large tracts of lands where he's experimenting with these new kinds of cattle, and the other one is game farming. I tried the other day, and I sat with some very clever guys to say, if in the event that we did land expropriation and we stuffed it up and the land dropped prices and it was horrible, who would lose the most in this country? And it's very difficult to say, but if you look at the published figures, the person who I think would lose the most money would be Johan Rupert. I think Johan Rupert, his father, has invested so extensively in so many. We look at the Eastern Cape, and they own the Eastern Cape. Graaf Reinet, all those places pretty much are theirs. If you stuffed up the land completely, Johan Rupert would probably lose the most. The next person who would probably lose the most are several hundred commercial farms. Before anybody shoots me down, I'm sure there's guys who do farming here. The reality is that there are probably less, and there are more, I know there are more, but there are probably less than 1,000 farms who produce probably 60% of the food in this country. To be a successful farmer in this country today, you have to be part of a consortium. You have to be part of a company. I went down and spoke to the farmers' unions down in the Western Cape. I went to the Swartland. You know, when you guys eat your wheat pix and all those lovely little cereals, they all come from the Swartland. And when I went there and spoke to Jannie Smuts' great-grandson, Perry Smuts, and I said, Perry, this expropriation thing must have you worried. He said, "You can call my plaas no fat." He said, because the reality is, even I can't afford to run this farm. It is only by us merging together into massive consortiums that I can survive. He says, my tractors cost me 7 million rand each. They get fixed with iPads. The engineers come out there and plug it into my John Deere and fix it up like that. He says, you don't take one person's farm, you have got to take consortiums of the farm. So we go to the fruit farms of Ceres. You've all drunk those Ceres juices and things like that. It's not the Toit apple farm. Yes, he's one of the major players, but it's a massive organization. Those are the guys that would lose the most money if we did something stupid in terms of farming. But as a private individual, I think Cyril Ramaphosa would be right out there. He would be in the top 2 or 3 individuals who would lose the most money if we did this wrong. So we're looking at a guy who makes up his own mind. He's a brilliant negotiator. He plans for the long term. The one thing that everybody said when he was making his money, they said, when you run 2.6 billion, you don't sit there and do everything. Everyone congratulated him because he always picked the right guys. He picked the right people for the right jobs. Oh my word, isn't that the kind of person you want as a president? That he picked the right people. But when he had his very first thing to do, he changed the cabinet. Everyone said to me, well, look, he stuffed it up already. He fired the obvious 7 Gupta acolytes. But why did he get rid of Malusi or Batamini Dlamini? Why did he only change those 3 portfolios? Think about it. He's only just won the election by the skinniest little margin. And he did the one thing that a clever CEO would do. He closed the piggy bank down. He put Nene in charge of finance. He put Pravin Gordhan in charge of state-owned enterprise when all the money was disappearing. And he put his brother-in-law in charge of energy to make sure that the Russians didn't sneak in and make some little nuclear deal behind the scenes. He can't fire Batamini Dlamini. She is the president of the ANC Women's League. If he gets rid of her, he doesn't win the next election. Just because he's been voted in the ANC caucus. If they do badly in the next election, there's absolutely no reason why the ANC can't remove Cyril Ramaphosa and put somebody else in his place. If they don't do well at the election next year, you could have a situation where David Mabuza might be our next president, or Nkosazana Zuma might be coming back. And every decision I see the president making at the moment, I see a political motive. I see him thinking carefully and thinking a few months ahead, not tomorrow. He's thinking towards the elections. Every decision he gets in, he gives you state of the nation, he changes the parliament. The next meeting he has, the very next meeting, his very good friend Julius stands up and says the following thing is, Julius has suddenly been emasculated when Jacob Zuma left, because the entire premise of the EFF was pay back the money, Zuma must go, get rid of the Guptas, and in one foul sweep, in a matter of days, that's all happened. So what's Julius got left? So he stands up and his very first sentence in Parliament is, I'd like to raise a motion, and the motion is, I want land expropriation without compensation. What is the answer? The President looks at him, go YouTube it, looks at him in the eye and says, ANC already agreed to that in December, thank you very much, it's on the table, sit down, Mr. Malema. Are Julius and Cyril friends out of interest? When Cyril came back as the Deputy President, the very first job he was given, as the Deputy President, was to run the disciplinary hearing of Julius Malema. Now, whether you believe it or not, in the DA and the ANC, there are disciplinary hearings happening every single month. You very rarely, other than Patricia, hear of people, and she wasn't even fired, she eventually had to resign. You very rarely hear of people being fined, is that not so? You get slapped on the wrist, you get clapped across the face, pay a fine, go for suspension. Diane Kohler Barnard from the DA get suspended for a few months for saying naughty things on Facebook. Not so with young Julius, not so with our president, because you see, our president doesn't come from a political background. He's not that nice. He comes from a company background. You stuff around, you get fired. And so his very first decision he makes as deputy president is to fire Julius. And Julius, to this day, they are not good buddies, which for us is an exceptionally good sign. So now we're sitting with a president who would lose as much money as you would. In fact, he would lose a lot more money than you if we don't do this process right. We're sitting with a president who is probably far more concerned that the Constitution doesn't get messed up. And we're sitting with a man that I believe is going to make substantial, radical changes. I want to go back to the words of Professor Rufor. We are standing on the cusp of being able to radically change the future of this country, and we have to do it using the vehicles that are appropriate, and one of the vehicles that is appropriate is land reform. I listened to Tuli Madonsela speak to 600 developers in the Western Cape, and these were her words. First of all, she's got such a lovely way about her. She always calls us dear colleagues. So you immediately think, well, she's on my side. She looks at all the developers and she says, dear colleagues. You know, we all know the injustice that has happened in the past. But I want to remind you of a story that happened in the 17th century in France, where there were a few people who had everything, who sat there and played music and ate cake, while the people out there were looking for bread. And when the message eventually got to those guys inside those hallowed courts, and the people said, what do you mean they don't have bread? If they don't have bread, surely there must be some cake lying around that they can have, because that's how far removed they became from the people who had not. And she looked at us and she said, there are 7% black ownership of land in urban environments and 1% ownership in terms of rural land ownership. We've been given this opportunity to not sit in your little hallowed sanctuaries and courts eating cake until the people lose their compassion. And for me, that was a massive, massive statement. The second thing that she said, as the public protector, I sat and I was attacked by everyone, including the very person who put me in the job, that the president was in the Hawks and the police and everybody was coming to me, every single thing that they had. We've got something in this country called Section 9 companies. Section 9 companies are set up to protect us as the people. This is everything that rules from ombudsmans and high courts and the constitutional court. Anybody that's set up there, the public protector, anyone that's set up there, she said, never once was I let down by my Section 9 companies. I want you to trust the process. She believes that the Constitution needs to be tweaked. It needs to be tweaked. But she said, once that happens, it will go in front of these Section 9 companies, and it could take a very long time. And she says, I want you to trust that whatever the decision is that is made finally, that it will be the right decision. And that's exactly how I feel. I believe we've been given this once-off opportunity to fix everything, and I believe we can do it. The 2019 elections are going to be absolutely crucial to us. I'm not going to go there to complete another presentation. But the 2019 elections are absolutely crucial. And I pray that Cyril Ramaphosa does well. Because I think the consequences of him not doing well is I'll have to sit down and start another story in another book. Because what happens at this moment in time, I believe we have one of the most amazing human beings who potentially can take this country into stratospheric heights. That we can be the South Africa and the Africa that I believe we deserve to be and in every potential to be. But it all depends on the following elections. But Brand Pretoria said it better than I did. He spoke about hope. I speak about fear. We've got to get over that fear. We've got to change the story. We've got to change the narrative. We've got to start speaking well about these things. We can't start walking around as estate agents and going, this place is stuffed. We can't start walking around and saying nothing's working. We can't start walking around and saying, don't buy a house with this land expropriation, will kill everything. Because it's not the truth. It's not the truth. My message is exactly the same as that of brother and I could have sworn we got together. It's a message of hope. If you have no hope, don't waste your time here, get the hell out. But if you have the slightest inclination that this potentially could be one of the most successful and revolutionary movements that we've seen, then start speaking about it. Start telling people the positive things. Now, I operate in two spheres. I operate very well as a political and economic commentator, and very often I operate as a motivational speaker. People often say to me, how can you motivate people? And the answer is, you can't really motivate people. The only people who can motivate yourself is yourself. But I love, there's a guy called Gary Vaynerchuk on the TV, on YouTube. Does anybody listen to him? Youngster. Yes, he's rude, eh? I love him. He's a motivational speaker, and I saw him in the one meeting, and he was going on, the person said, I'm here, inspire me. He looked at the guy and he said, I'm going to inspire you in 3 words. I was like, what are those 3 words? If I only knew this, I could get paid double. His words were, you're going to die. So what the hell are you doing here? Moaning and groaning and living half a life when you could be going out there and living this amazing existence in paradise. Do you know how excited I got here when I was here today? I saw grass. I saw green grass. Do you know what it's like to shower for 1.5 years in a bucket for 2 minutes at a time? I said to the lady who brought me over, I said to her, do you know I haven't had a bath in 12 months? She said, ugh. I've had very short showers. Do you know how good you have it? I said to Dion today when I walked in, and this is a compliment to you guys, I give talks across the country, sometimes anything from 120 to 180 presentations today. This has been one of the most fun, well-organized meetings I've been to in a very long time. I've been exceptionally well treated by every single person who's walked up to me and been nice to me. What is there to fear? Make the most of your life. Look for the positive. Amplify the good news. Look for those things that are good. We can either absorb all the negative and it will eventually break you. Or we can say, enough is enough. I only want the good. If any of you want to connect with me, I'm on social media. I am the only big positive guy in the world. So if you go to Google and say, who is the big positive guy? That's me. If you want to hear some positive news, connect with me on social media. Other than that, to KVV Inc. and to you, the guys that have invited me, thank you. It's been my privilege. Thank you.